Welcome back to FreedoniaCon 2025. We're starting our morning off with the fabulous Karol and Michael, who are part of the Erton team and driving forces behind the Legends of Barsaive. I'll let you guys take it.
Hi, thanks, Andy. So this is we've done a few of these. This is third or fourth one, maybe. I was talking to Karol about this. So I think for the first half hour, we're going to keep it quote unquote spoiler free. And by spoilers, we're like the first 8 adventures are kind of fair game at this point. They've been out in the wild. So if we have people in the audience that have questions related to that, or Karol and I will just kind of back and forth a couple of questions to each other. Then once we hit the half hour mark, then we'll take, adventures 9 through 12 are kind of be the quote unquote spoiler section. They're out there, but most people may have not have seen them. So you got to keep that content more or less secret, and then everything after will be vague. So Karol, I got the first question. I have. Does this sound good to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Throw it my way.
All right. First question I have, because obviously Kyle was kind of the driving force behind this, and he talked to me separately. So I'm curious, how did Kyle pitch this to you? Because I don't think I've ever actually heard that story.
Ooh, yeah. I think, at the time we were talking about seeing adventures, what adventures were, we're getting a lot of traction from people, how we could get buy-in for things, just it was basically like Earth Dawn, it's about building your legend, it's about bigger stories. How can we adapt this in a way that makes sense for a con format, which is typically one shot, disconnected? Maybe there might be an overall connected story, but you might not even be playing the same character or anything like that. So I know he'd kind of hit the ground running looking at other games and what they were doing. And the campaigns were starting to, be very, very popular. So yeah, he talked about, do you think we can hammer this out into a format where, you can carry over characters, they're experiencing all of these things in the same, in the same space and kind of in the same timeline, even if it's a little bit nebulous with con slots and things like that. And I thought it sounded great. And I know, you know, for, bigger peek behind the curtain, I guess, Kyle and I had been roommates in college, and that's where we both kind of, in our and both kind of realized independently, or I guess together at the same time, that we had independently found Earth Dawn and become like obsessed with it. And so that's when we started, really, really enjoying like, talking through ideas and scenarios and different things like that. I know we both had a huge love of Haven and Parlainth as this, this interesting microcosm of Earth Dawn as a whole, where you have all these outside powers looking at this kind of frontier boom town that's just trying to get by, and then right in it, ruin, full of monsters, full of danger, very mega dungeony kind of in its own way. But even in in true Earth Dawn fashion, like there's still politics involved. There's still plotting and scheming and factions and different things like that. So we thought that would make like such a good starting point for a living campaign, because it's got tinges of all of the greater conflicts that make Barsaive such a melting pot, but also a flashpoint. But at the same time, it's got so much of its own stuff going on that you could fully root something directly in that space. So he was like, let's try this living campaign format. Let's hammer out how it's going to work, and let's see if we can do it. Let's see if Haven is a workable one, because it, in our opinion, shared opinion, like it hadn't really quite gotten the love in a little while that it had deserved. So we were like, yes, let's do it. It's a good sandbox. It's also not going to hopefully mess with too much that other other products that the Earthbound team might be working on. There's not going to be too much overlap there where we start. So I was all in. It sounded great, and that's kind of where the idea started coming together. Yeah. Dang. Now I got to volley one back to you, Michael. Since you caught me right at the beginning here. This this might be a question that you've already answered with Kyle, but it's new to me, so that's why I'm gonna go ahead and ask it. What of your most like surprising experiences in team adventure as written and when you're running it at a con? Like, has a table ever like truly blown you away or caught you completely off guard with the way that they were approaching a situation or their assumptions?
Yeah, I think I've talked about the example of that being in part 7. But when they go to the Bloodwood, like people really got caught up in, like kind of like you were saying, like there's the adventure aspect, and then like behind everything in our politics. And the players really got caught up in like the internal politics of Kara Eidolon, which I did not expect. It was supposed to be one scene. They were just supposed to go in there, do something quick in their best interest, and they were supposed to go through. That adventure was supposed to be much more heavily into the Bloodwood. But when people kept playing it, they kept asking questions, and they kept trying to say, well, maybe we get a better deal from the Seekers of the Heart versus getting a better deal from the mayor of the town, basically. So it was people got much more invested in the intrigue. It really kept coming up. Like the first table, they went left. The second table went right. The third table went up the middle. But they all invested a lot more time and interest in what was happening at Kara Eidolon, which I had totally not planned for. So that most of that front half of that module was ad-libbed at a table and then basically written up based on what players actually ended up doing, completely unplanned.
I love that. That's why we play test, right?
They never like they stay in the box, not necessarily on the rails.
Yeah.
That's a great question. I think that's always interesting. So, what on a similar vein, like what's something that you either did plan for and it went completely unexpected, or something you didn't plan for that became like central or a major plot point in an adventure that you wrote?
Ooh. I think the easiest example I can think of is actually last year, and it's not, it's not for another quick like peek behind the curtain of how we try to design these adventures. Uh, you know, with when you're working with like a group at your own table, you kind of have the luxury of understanding what everybody's preferences are of play styles, so that you can be like, okay, this person's really into investigation, or this group is really into investigation, so we'll really lean into that. Or they're social players, so they really like the role play and the politicking and things like that, so we'll lean into that. Or just I got a table combat, just go direct at them and see like what wacky combats can happen, or Earthdawn's great for that. With convention play, because you don't necessarily know who all you're going to have at your table, you try to cater a little bit to everybody. So at least in the initial adventures that we were putting together, I remember being very intentional about like, okay, here's our big combat scene, here's our big social scene, here's our big investigation scene or skill challenge, and then here are a couple that might go a couple of different ways. Um, and one of the things that I found really surprising, because last year I opted at Gen Con to basically just do the intro adventures. I think I did LoBs 2, 3, and 4. What was really interesting was seeing how like you usually have a mix of people at the table. I somehow ended up getting like 2 of the 3 tables were very focused on one style of play, and one was like, 102 is really interesting because there are combat sequences in there, but my group did not want to fight like that. So they were taking every opportunity they could to like, yeah, gather info ahead of time, try to leverage that info, like really just even in the final fight, like their whole thing was like we're trying to I mean, well, 102 is fair game. So with the cadaver man, like in that final fight, you have someone who's, oh my god, I'm like totally I'm gonna butcher the actual reality of it, but I think they made sure to capture his because and they also were like trying to make like an impassioned plea to like I think one of the cadaver men that was like recently converted to like stand down or something like that, and I was like, all right, like we'll let the dice tell the story, we'll see if this will happen. And the cadaver men like very clear, like they like helped the cadaver men like turn against Grizz to kind of help restrain him. So that was it was very out of pocket, for what I was expecting for it, which was like, okay, great. Some timing of the chase sequencing and everything like that up to that point. Like we'll figure that out. And yeah, and they ended up being like hardcore anti-combat. And I was like, you know what? This is great. This is going to be a very unique experience for everybody here. Everybody's in agreement, so let's make it happen. So a lot of like pivoting on the fly happened there, and then another group, the group playing 103, were like, even though 103 is kind of, I always see it as like a Coen Brothers movie almost, where you're watching someone else's like growing misfortunes to get them a deeper situation that you don't think they can dig their way out of. Um, and in that one, my group was like, no, we're fighting everybody at all times. So like the second there was a bar brawl opportunity, they were like, no, we're immediately diving into this fight. Like we're gonna dominate the room with our abilities. Very, very itchy trigger finger. And yeah, even at the final confrontation where it was like, you might get a little something extra for bringing people back alive. They were like, do we have to? Let's just fight them out. And I was like, wow. And that was also like kind of the opposite. So it's funny running those back to back and having such opposite experiences from like pure role play to pure combat.
I run into that a lot, and specifically at conventions, because you can, like you mentioned, you can kind of get like the personalities at play come much more in interplay, like at conventions, like 6 random people. How are they going to interact with each other socially? That really dictates some of their actions. Because you get those people that are just agreeable and will like, 1 or 2 people will make up a plan. Everybody like, yeah, and then you have those people that just have to combat each other. Like with somebody will have like a soapbox they're on and like completely against the table the whole time. So it's so interesting. And earlier, when we first started this, I was running the early adventures again more frequently. At like Gen Con, usually I'd run the same one at least 2, maybe I'd do it all 3 times. And then you get the 6 different people with the exact same setup. They come up with completely different answers, completely different methodologies, and it's fascinating from the perspective. And you don't always get that in a home campaign. That's the one interesting thing about running the same thing over and over and over again with different people instead of running different things with the same people, because you get those different social dynamics each time.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel like you end up getting that like, I mean, that's the thing that's wonderful about a home group, right? Is that your table are also your friends. Like you build relationships outside of the table, but you also build relationships within the table, and you kind of get to know each other's styles. And that's where GM used to have a story to be more not just necessarily, maybe the beats that this person is looking to hit in a plot, but also like, understanding people's problem solving methodology, and then figuring out how you can kind of adapt these problems to the way that they want to solve them. It's really neat. And then yeah, the convention play is just sort of like, all right, you're in the hot seat. Like time to figure out how this person approaches this, and all you have is a cold read.
Oh, it's actually funny you say that, because the first half of it, there's 5 puzzles people get to choose from. They only have to complete 2 of them. And designing 5 unique puzzles in itself was a challenge, but getting 5 unique puzzles that people can understand and wrap their heads around in different. I remember one of the original ones. I think it's the sand puzzle. There's basically a riddle, and they have to stack totems in a proper order. And the first time I ran it, like it went so smoothly, nothing happened. It was great. It's like, oh, first shot. That's odd. And then I think I ran it second time, and no one knew how to do anything. They were completely confused. I was like, well, that's a problem I got to fix. So I ended up adding some like feedback when they got the correct answer. They effectively got like a ding. And that, like I said, that was not something that was in the original playtest, because everybody seemed to work it out fine. So clearly there was somebody that was on my wavelength the first time. And I think by the end of it, like I think Kyle had a feedback. He's like, "This seems really complicated." It's like, no, I've run it enough where it works. They're supposed to struggle, and then I think I added in some additional hints in the troubleshooting section based on Kyle's comments as well. So that was one of those things where it seemed to work fine, but the more people it got exposed to, the less clear the path seemed to become.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that. This is gonna keep it again spoiler free because we're getting into post 8 territory. But I remember with 111, I included some riddle components, and it was pretty much the exact same thing. I uh, that people were like, "Oh, cool! Like this is like a fun like word trick riddle or something like that. Let's do it." And seemed like it was barely an obstacle, and to the point where I was thinking like, "Oh, I might just eliminate this from from the adventure altogether if it's just going to be something that people leap over instead of actually hitting as an obstacle." And then the first time I ran it, people were like, "This is impossible! Like, what the heck is this supposed to be?" And I ended up just sort of saying like, if you're talking at the table and anyone says the word, it'll just pop up. And that actually had me go back into the adventure and then kind of, at least for con play, kind of jury rig, and then later fully edit into the finalized adventure a basically brute force alternative if someone couldn't make it happen. um, yeah, it's interesting thinking about like people's, again, like problem solving approaches, but also how they take in information and how they process information. And yeah, that's been like a really fun, sometimes terrifying when you're caught out in the middle of it. But kind of exciting, improv element almost, when you're running for a group of people at a table that you don't all know or don't know all of. Um, yeah. Dang, I had a question for you and it just like completely went out of my mind. Oh, yes. Okay, I got one for you, Michael, because I think I was reflecting on, my process. So I have an answer queued up for this already. So this is just me putting you on the spot. But how do you feel like your approach to crafting the LOB adventures changed from the first batch of a couple that we were working on to where we are now, or even like intermediate steps of like how you've changed, writing process, or just like how you parse out scenes, or even just how you kind of construct the overall structure of an adventure.
Yeah, so I would say I've definitely I think I've written the most adventures actually out of the three of us, oddly enough. And that was mainly
Yeah.
due to the story beats that we wanted to hit. It just the ideas I had just seemed to fit the story beats, oddly enough. Because I actually, what people don't know is we originally had 24 adventures planned, and then we had an equal split. I think we were all doing. We all had like an 8 adventure arc, and then
Yeah.
we scaled back down to 16, so things got removed and moved around. But like my writing process from the get go, and this was something where I learned running home games as well. It's like you run something very scripted, and you can think, people are going to take this from this, and you can lay out the breadcrumbs in a straight line, and as they will miss the very first breadcrumb and go to the left and look at a tree, and then you're just improvising at the table. So I learned very early on that writing process. I kind of and I think I've talked about this before. I write backwards, where I know where they need to end. So I have a scene laid out of this scene goes to this scene, this scene goes. So the breadcrumbs and the trail between breadcrumbs completely up to the first play testers. I listen to them, see what they do. I try to encourage them in specific directions, but ultimately what's written in most of my modules are ideas and pathways that players have come up with a table, and then from there I kind of frame it in a way with the block text and other hints and crumbs and whatnot to push them in the direction I want. And then I've definitely learned how to corral players at a convention, and so a lot of times people think, oh, we're way off script. It's like, oh, you're not supposed to be. So um, that's kind of my process. Is I know what a scene needs to accomplish, the start to end, and then whatever happens in the middle is usually what a player has come up with, and what I've most consistently been able to convince people to do. So what about your process?
Ooh, yeah. I think you kind of nailed it. Where I think living in that interplay of idea versus execution is something that I've learned to embrace a lot more. Um, I know with the first adventure, I was very nervous about the idea of like how you take uh something that I typically think of as a more open-ended thing where like you have the story beats, but you kind of, again, weird peek behind the curtain here for me where like I treat it almost like an improv scene where I'm like, I know point A and how the players need to get to point B, but I'm going to leave a lot of room open, not draw too many individual lines between A and B to kind of, play around with players at the table. And with convention play, I remember when I was first doing 103, um, uh, it was definitely like, okay, I understand like the parameters are different. It's a con game. We have a very limited, time window. How are we going to take that, or like how do I take that method and channel it in a way that is going to feel like it's a coherent single story? And I consulted some other stuff, and um, I think 103 to me probably feels the most like on rails thing that I made, just because I was like, okay, there's not a lot of room for exploration or too much, deviating from the path. So I thought like kind of that weird like chase format would lend itself well to things. And I definitely found that, as I was starting to play test with friends and acquaintances and stuff, people were like, well, I kind of want to take time to do this, or like I'd like to, take more of a different approach to this. So I think it helped to kind of see that, oh yeah, again, like no matter what you're doing, you're going to have people with different approaches and different ideas things. So I think that helps me with making adventures more spread out in the types of things that you're doing. Um, and I think also one thing that it really cemented for me as I was playing was at a convention table. I'm a real big proponent of like the one cool moment strategy, which is basically I want every single person at my table to leave the adventure at the end of our time slot or at the end of the however long we've taken to play with like one cool moment there. They hero or do the very cool thing where with a powerful sword strike they felled the boss, or with a single word they were able to turn aside a conflict or something like that, or like cast like the coolest spell. And sometimes the dice are going to dictate that because of explosions and how silly things can get with that, but sometimes it's just sort of uh, you want to make sure you're giving people as much flexibility to make that happen. And I feel like, I don't know, you know kind of talking here, it's me thinking about how, like our first four adventures that we wrote, our first block of four, I felt like we were much more linear. I don't want to say rigid necessarily, but it was a much more straightforward process. And then it was funny, like writing and also like cross editing and different things for the next four, where I feel like all of us kind of simultaneously threw out like the standard format and really started playing with the idea of format. um,
Yeah,
and I
I
re-
definitely agree with that. And the other interesting things, like as we were cross editing, it's interesting how often we work as we frame these independently. We all kind of talked about the overarching story, but like the actual like individual details of modules are usually scripted in a bubble. It's fascinating to me how many times we all came up with the same idea or the same enemy, or there was a time when I think we all used Cadaver Men in the second block, and I think we all ended up going to the well in like the third block, like well, we all had the well at the center of parlay all came up. It actually got cut from my part 12, but it was just really funny because I was editing one of Kyle's adventures. It's like, oh, he goes to the well and he scripts it up, and that's not how I wrote the well.
I had that exact same situation.
Yeah, yeah. I think you had the well in your adventure too, and you're like, oh, I had this. So it was.
Sure did.
Uh,
Yeah, it
so
was it was just funny to me though, because I felt like looking at the second block of adventures, I was like, oh, we all kind of went with a more boxy approach in certain things where we have like, again, like we're at beats. But in between those beats, we want to have people be more self-directed, in what they're doing. And I just remember like Games of the Hungry, like reading through that for Kyle, and I was just like, wow, it really feels to me like we had a similar approach, and like, you're in one general area, and within it, there's a bunch of stuff to do, and you interact with it like at the at the pace or at the or in the order that you want. And I was just like so tickled by that. And like where like the 5 puzzles and like how you interact with those. I'm like, this is great. Like we're all learning and growing, like taking very similar lessons away as we're going through the process, and I like that a lot.
That's also really funny. Like the first 4, and this was not scripted or anything. It's just how it ended up working out. The first 4 adventures, they all pretty much stay within Haven, and then the second 4 adventures, they all leave Haven. Either like I send them to Parlance, I send them to Bloodwood. You send them outside, and Kyle sends them to out farther Parlance. So I'll kind of like sent them away, and then 9 through 12, I think it's kind of a good mix. We kind of have a go out to Parlance and come back and deal with stuff in Haven. So it's just interesting how that all again it all seems a lot more planned than it actually was.
It's funny, yeah, thinking back just like how very organic it was. And I think you hit the nail on the head where it was just like, as we start looking at each other's stuff, we're like, oh, cool, he did this, this is great. And then just kind of playing with that, it was really, really fun to see in action. Um, yeah, I'm very pleased that like seeing, now that we're a few years in, just like the arcs that we've taken and how parallel they've been.
So I'm gonna hit you with we're just about at the half hour mark, so I'll hit you with a question, and maybe we can progress in the spoiler section. But out of the first 12 adventures, the ones that have been written and published, which one is your favorite and why?
Ooh.
You knew it was coming. Had to ask it.
That's a real hard one. I think. Ooh. Let me vamp for a little bit while I continue to think through this. I I really enjoyed Games of the Hungry. Having mentioned it already. So maybe it's not too big of a surprise there. But I think from editing it to then like running it for people, I found like the most silliness related to it. And I think there's like a funny tonal shift because in my mind, and of course not everyone's going to necessarily be in this mindset, but like Belleron, who runs Garland's Almhouse or Almshouse, like I'm always going to get the name mixed up about that. Garland's Alms. Um, like figure out like how in deep he is and like just not in a great place and continually doing kind of shady stuff to get by. And so it's very funny going from like a lot of intrigue related things to then this almost like in a weird way comic relief situation. But then like once you figure out what he's doing, you're like, all right, we're back in the dark now because we are going into literally like a combat arena situation, between Cadaver and yeah, like I think like the Cadaver Men like are, when you mentioned like we all kind of ended up peppering them into our adventures um in a given block, like that was just one where for seasoned players of Earth Dawn, like we know that a Cadaver Man is no joke. It seems like it might be fine. People coming into it might think it's just a regular zombie, and then with that first hit and the frenzy, that situation gets a lot more dangerous all of a sudden. So like going from like this goofy Bell how we get out of this one to then like, oh, and now we've been dropped into quite possibly one of the most dangerous situations we've ever been dropped into because it's just the 5th in the series. That was a big funny one for me. But yeah, how about yourself, Michael? What's your fave?
I think it's thinking kind of. It's still. I still have a consistent answer. It's still part 7. That one, like I think I mentioned it earlier. Like that one diverged very far away from my original idea, but it also like a lot of that. The very original idea behind part 7 was they were going to go out to Bloodwood and deal with some stuff like outside of Haven, and I really wanted to tie that to the Elven Nations book, which was it was out there, but it wasn't. It was still being worked on. And so one of my original pitches was, yeah, we could tie this to the Elven Nations book. And this was before we were officially a team. We were just a pack of kids running stuff at conventions for FASA. They're like, yeah, that'd be cool. I was like, yeah, like, should I get a preview copy of it so I could like tie things together? And it never really came. And then what ended up happening was that we ended up writing the Elven Nations book, or kind of taking it from where it was and getting it to the final product. So
No, you
my
guys wrote
original
it
intention
totally from scratch.
I don't know if we wanted to pull the veil that far behind, but yes, we wrote it.
You totally wrote it from scratch, and you did a great job.
So the point to this story and why Part 7 has such a nice place in my heart is, in place of taking stuff from Elven putting it in the module was run and written before Elven Nations came out. So the stuff that I needed from Elven Nations got written as part of the module, and then that stuff got imparted into. So the politics of Kaer Eidolon, the map of Kaer Eidolon, and all the NPC characters around there that I created were actually created for LoB Part 7, and then got expanded and written up into the actual Elven Nations book. So those two, it's like a dichotomy of, it's supposed to be one, but the other, it ended up flipping out. So that one's always going to be a special module for me.
I love it. Yeah, it's funny thinking about, LOB we thought was going to be really our kind of foot in the door here, to get involved in Earth Dawn. And then, yeah, I know it's an LOB panel, but we're going to toot our horn a little bit about Elven Nations. And just really we're like, okay, pretty aggressive deadline we need to meet for this. Let's just go for it. And I'm also gonna plug Josh and Dan's Earthbound Survival Guide, because they've said a lot of wonderful things about our stuff, and also give like really good quick overviews of the material in there if you're on the fence about getting it, which hopefully you're not. Hopefully we've already sold you on it, but yeah, it's definitely fun. It was fun kind of shifting that weird way from I think honestly 107, now that you're talking about it, that must be such a good I want to say catharsis almost, or closure element, where you get to go from writing all this source material, I'm stopping just shy of people getting a story, or I'm stopping just shy of writing a plot out for this, because I need to, as a setting book writer, you're not writing the story, you're writing all of the material to get your DMs set up for their own stories. And then it was just there's so much cool stuff I want to explore. And then you just then you get to go into LOB and you're like, oh, I can link this in. This is fun. And I know from the start we had wanted Bloodwood to be an element in that. So it really did end up fitting in really nicely.
Yeah, it was nice, and it was nice to impart a few other ties and nods between the stuff that we read up for Elven Nations and some of the later modules. Stuff that was kind of concepted for the Elven Nations, that I concepted for the Elven Nations book, kind of interacts with LOB 113. Just to give a vague plug there.
Yeah.
So now we're in the 9 through 12. So we're going to get into spoilers for anything that's been published up to now. So out of the 9 through 12 block, Karol, how do you think those compare? Because that was kind of the break point we ended up, and again, it's kind of just organic of it. That's kind of the break point where we're starting to get into some higher circle stuff. We expect people to at least have some knowledge of Legends of Barsaive. Not that it's required, but that's when we get to start calling back decisions. And actually we the PGN kind of upgrade to third circle at that point when you start in Part 9. So if you come and play with us at a convention, we'll give you a little bit more hit points for those adventures. So I guess how do you see that kind of upgrade, that kind of increased threat level? Because I think we all kind of ended up going into a bit more danger in that block. So I guess do you have an approach, or does it just kind of organically grow out of what you've done before?
I think it's kind of twofold. I think one of the things is, with a swingy dice system, it can be very hard to control very strictly, for threat level, because we've all run into the same situation where, your least enemy, a random forest critter or whatever, ends up like super exploding on a damaged die and knocking out your big fighter or something like that, or equally disastrous kind of situations like that. But that's kind of the fun, wacky, out of pocket situations that we love as well. That's kind of what makes the exploding that element of chance. But then thinking about like how you control for the feeling of urgency or the feeling of um, heightened threat or other things like that. That was definitely very heavy in the back of my mind because I'm like, again, we circled everybody up. We want to make sure with some of the new toys, like abilities or potentially, some weapons that have gotten or weapons and armor that have gotten improved. Like we want you to be able to play with all of those toys, play with your full toolkit. Um, but then at the same time, like, you're more powerful. How do you make sure this is you? And I think with that, like, I think we, taking a step back at 9 through 12, it's interesting seeing the different ways that we address that because I think we put, like very difficult choices in front of people in a way that we hadn't necessarily. And then for me, um, the way that growth potential ended up playing out for me, it was very like, all right, I got very into the idea of like a counter or clock mechanic kind of playing around in the background. Uh, so, okay, players have choices that they can make within this. It is not a completely on rails situation. There's a sandboxy element. However, those choices are going to have consequences attached that you don't automatically see. So then it's sort of you're playing strategically the way you would always play strategically in a tabletop game where you're trying to accomplish a goal, but at the same time you're having to think about the pieces on the board that you can't see. Um, and I think like that kind of uncertainty, fog of war type of situation, the way plan things out. And so a lot of a lot of the stuff that I ended up putting into 111 was like, if they get here at this time, or if they get here with this much time to spare, this is what the situation is going to look like. So a lot of the scenarios I ended up trying to make variable based on how much they were dragging their feet or how quickly they were speeding through the kind of chase element of it. So I really enjoyed playing with that, and I think those kind of constraints are just generally something that are fun when players get into high levels. uh, you put important choices in front of people, uh, put them into tough situations where like you can't save everyone, or you might not have the right information, and you just kind of have to make a tough choice, and that tough choice might have consequences. So yeah, I think that was a big motivator there.
Yeah, I agree. Like harder choices, like more, and that was always one of my goals was to make players, consequences of their actions are going to reverberate in the future, and you can make the easy decision now, but that makes it harder for you in the future. Whereas you do the right hard thing now, then it makes it easier for you. I tried to start lacing that in, and now is where we can kind of pull. It's like, oh, you did that 2 modules ago, so now this happens. Um, and definitely in so for part 12, I think that the lethality factor definitely went up. And also like I was just saying, the harder choices. So there's a scripted moment in there where you have to effectively go against one of the venturing companies. Karol Grant is very angry with you, and she requests that people who snuck into her territory, some of them have to pledge loyalty to her and serve her for a year, and there's no way out of it. It's a scripted, forced moment where the players can either let screw over, quote unquote, the strongest arm, or screw over the caravan. And everybody that I've ever played this module with has always conscripted the strongest arm people to charcoal grain. No one's ever tried to say, "Oh, the caravan, the shady people, we want to release the noble people." They're all like, "Oh, the strongest arm people are probably going to be able to survive better, so make them do it." So that's an interesting bit of tidbit from behind the veil.
Yeah, that is interesting. How do
I
you?
always thought like people, when we set up the adventuring companies, kind of play off each other in kind of a bouncy way. And there's the original idea that they would be balanced, where it would be like two on one side of an issue, two on the other side of an issue, and that's kind of the towing the line for the players to influence. And it's one of those like elements that I think I never really took full advantage of. But it's always interesting to see how people interact with the caravan. I've certainly framed the caravan as shadier, and I think that was one of our goals. Is they were the less noble, more opportunistic companies. And people realize that, but I've always thought people would resent them a little bit more. But at the end of the day, like, most people just like, this is just how they are. It's like, all right.
And like, all right, here we go. Yeah, that's very interesting. I hadn't known that. What 112 to me is just like so interesting in general because like, the moment with Torgak too, where like I think it's weirdly, it may not necessarily be long term, consequences or things like that, but this person that like you have this complicated relationship with, and in like a very, I'm still gonna try to talk as spoiler as possible, but like in that moment, like the right at the climax of it, it's just like, okay, like what do I do with this guy? Do I listen to him? Do I try and help him out, or do I deal with what this other power is like, yelling to me right now? And I think that's like a really culmination. And kudos to you for it, where I was just like, this is a great like heroic moment that you're at the periphery of, and you still have like a lot of power in that situation. Um, but a lot of the payoff for it, I feel like, is deeply personal as opposed to like, you know, uh, like you're affecting the full outcome of this particular situation because you have a much bigger situation, which is the Haven wide stuff going on that you're dealing with. So like it's kind of a fun, like weird, like you go from like mass disaster and things like that to suddenly zooming in very closely to this one fight. And I really enjoy that as like a climactic moment.
Yeah. You're a lot nicer than me. I've been wanting to talk about this that moment openly since we first conceived it, but I've been trying to keep it as possible. We'll keep it vague.
Yeah.
That's probably better.
Yeah, we
So
want to.
I agree. That was it's a difficult moment because it's one of those story beats that we as the writers it ends in a very specific manner, and there's no real leeway to that. But making players believe that there is an alternative way. So anybody that knows what we're talking about, there is no option, there is no sandbox, there is no if we did something differently, different outcome. That part 12 ends for everybody. There's only one piece of text that ends the module. Because that as writers we needed that story beat to do set up the rest of 13 through 16.
Yeah,
So it's
absolutely.
how do you frame it in a way that players feel like they have an influence, they feel like they have a choice, and no matter what we make, so there's a lot of logic and saying if players do this, this happens. Players do this happens. But ultimately, it all ends in that single moment that we've been really building up to for the point.
Yeah, it's very it's interesting because like there are so many circumstances around things that will change depending on how your table has played, or if you're playing it in a campaign, like what you've been building up. But it is very like, thinking about the multiverse stuff, and like, all these different threads of possibility. Everything still converges at this one point. And so the pieces that you have to pick up from it might be different, but like, yeah, this is the beat that happened. And this is we talked very much about, I think, um, at the very outset, kind of what we wanted our big story beats about, Haven as a whole to be. And I think, there's one of them was absolutely like the conflict between Torgak's gang and the Association of Unaffiliated Explorers. I hope I got that acronym right. AUE. And then one was like foreign influences on Haven and what those might mean. And then, the third one obviously was like the big bad effective situation. And I think we actually got a question from W. Socrates about any plans to make a supplement that'll tie everything together for a home campaign setting. Do you want to tackle that one first, Michael, or do you want me to take a stab at it?
Oh, you go for it.
Okay. Yeah, I think we've been trying to parse that out basically through the Haven collections. So 1 through 8, I know we wanted to put in a lot of work into to talk about how you can make things, make a main basically if you're doing things in there. I know Debbie did a great talk yesterday too about how to run things as a campaign as well. Um, with the next Haven supplement, it was the same kind of thought process there, where it's just how do we, this was developed for convention play initially, but we can absolutely, or you can absolutely take this and go into your home games and make an entire storyline out of it. We've tried to make that as big as possible. So the big things, and we haven't really finalized the process for the final Haven book, 13 through 16 when it comes out. But I think definitely thinking about like lead-ins and lead-outs and all of the other interstitial stuff that you can throw in to really make Haven come alive would be good. But I think there's a lot already in there in kind of our, our zero adventure, Masks of Fear, maybe not Masks of Fear, but like our general, like I think the initial kind of free Haven talk about the adventuring companies, um, and from the Parlance book as well that we could put in there. But there's, I think there's quite a lot of material to make a game out of already, and I think there are bits of Parlance that are like undefined enough where you have a lot of room to play around with for your table as well. But yeah, I think definitely giving more options for your, like, your home tables and some of the things they can explore is something that we can explore when we're getting into kind of the final Haven supplement.
Yeah, one of the things like tying things to a home campaign. One of the best things that you can do in my mind is like customize it to your players, and it's really we can't write something that will like tell you how to frame stuff towards your players. Like that's as a GM, you just kind of have to. So I think it's one of those things where if you want to run this in a home campaign, you start at the beginning and kind of learn how people are, and then there's definitely opportunities in the later modules to shift and change out characters or kind of massage events and whatnot based on how you think your players have reacted or what the plan is. But it's definitely some guide points and waypoints. It's definitely something we've talked about including in kind of the compilation material. His biggest concern is having something happen to an NPC that is needed for a later adventure. Well, you can always clones are a real GM tool. If you get somebody that's dead, you can always change their name and have them have the exact same personality, the exact same skills, the exact same eye color, but just a different name. So, but really, I feel like most of the time, like most of the really important key players that are needed in the future are well known enough that if they are either removed or never heard from again, that people will start asking about them. And that's always, again, consequences of action. So if players make a decision early to, unalive somebody, then maybe they don't get that job lead in the future. Maybe, maybe it makes them harder. They have to do more work or basically a branch of them is just gone. That's a completely valid thing to do in my opinion of you players made a decision and punishing isn't the right word, but consequences of actions are a thing that I think is very good, especially in a home campaign. You don't want your players to just come down and think they can do whatever they want. They obviously they can do whatever they want, but that doesn't mean that you as a GM can't make them give them consequences and make life harder for them. If they're going to make your life harder, you can always make their life harder too.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've we tried to create this the faction kind of like relationship mechanic, or like faction points as you're dealing with different adventuring companies, sort of as uh a shorthand way of dealing with like how different groups within Barsaive, or not even within Barsaive, within Haven specifically, are getting along with you based on like the help that you've given them. I think spinning that out, what we're doing is really down to quick mechanic for a con table, but that's something you can play around a lot with when you get into home games. So a thing is like, yeah, if something bad happens to an NPC, hopefully it hasn't happened off screen. We're trying not to have like bad things happen to NPCs that don't have player input, because players should be involved in all those actions. It's their play space. But if something happens to an NPC as a result of players' actions, would that change the relationship of that adventuring company with them, or with that, electrical faction? And that's something that you can then start having color future adventures where those groups might be involved. So, definitely there's stuff that we've probably or that we've oversimplified for con purposes, but that you can absolutely then spin out into much more complicated or involved, or honestly just reading your table and vibes based kind of stuff for your group. And I think Michael and I will probably be raving about yeah, like relationship and interaction more and more as we're kind of talking about playing at home tables, because that's think I'll never stop harping on that. Like Earth Dawn, very much, talking about the way that thread items work, and the way that, forging works, and the way that so many things that might require downtime or specific information works. That's where you can really start to tailor things to your individual players or to groups, and start thinking about how they would all fit together. So yeah, gonna sing those praises. Yeah, do we have if we got any other chat questions? Looks like we're clear for now. Yeah. So I would say, Michael, I got a question for you.
Yeah, shoot.
Since we're talking about home games already, and how you would potentially adapt things, how would you introduce the LoB adventures to a table as a home campaign? How would you get them set up for it? What would you want from your players in advance? And how might you change around personally some of the stuff that's in there? I'm not going to speak to, published material things, or, stuff that we've necessarily talked about in the Haven books. But yeah, what would be a big takeaway of yours as we're going through if you were running this for a table long term?
What would the goal of the adventures be, or how would I introduce it to the?
How would you introduce it and how would you prep for it?
I guess the easiest way to, if I was in a home campaign and I really wanted to run through these modules, introducing magic items that tie to parlaying is probably the easiest no-brainer way to do it. And that, or artifacts that tie or have specific value to parlaying. Always get people interested in what parlaying is and starting to learn about it. And then if they're, the easiest way is to, if get them to throw a direct line from the Mask of Fear, the Zero Adventures goes directly from Thrall to Parlane. So any kind of guys you can get them to go to the Grand Bazaar or meet with a noble in Thrall, and then able to push the breadcrumbs and then push them in a direction. That would be my recommendation. And obviously, magic items are always the key way. We included a couple of basic quote unquote or scripted magic items in thread items in the campaign that link directly to the campaign, but that doesn't preclude other people from having other. I feel that the best way to make somebody do something in Earth Dawn is hint or make them think that there's a key knowledge associated with one of their items in that direction. It's pretty easy to make them go that way.
Yeah, I like that. It's definitely an interesting reward system compared to some other games where it's not always about stuff, it's about knowledge. And that knowledge might make your stuff better, but it's still, a big a big kind of incentive that you don't normally see everywhere.
Yeah.
But yeah, I like that. I feel
Actually,
like whenever
I'm sorry to cut you off. I do have a second answer now that I'm thinking about it, because
ooh, yeah.
in part one, the LoB one, Toys in the Attic, there's a history or there's a timeline of where all the map pieces that come up in the first 8 adventures are, and one of them actually is most of them are outside of Parlane and come back to Parlane through actions of the adventuring company. So that would actually be a pretty good thread point as well. To get the players involved, bring them couriers of the map to the adventuring companies in place of Mask of Fear. You can just say, oh, they are, or actually during Mask of Fear, you can have that Mask of Fear be the means to which they are bringing the map piece back to the adventuring companies. I think the strongest arm and the lawbringers are the ones that are working together in that first adventure. So that would actually be an even easier and more plot relevant way to get them, is have them to be the couriers of the map. They follow Mask of Fear, and then that just leads
Ooh,
directly into part one.
I like that a lot. Like that a lot. Yeah, I'm very big on like session zero being as much about me describing the situation to the players as it is about me just sort of like reading them in the first place. And I think Earthdawn is like a very good setting in which to do this kind of thing where, maybe in another game you're gonna, oh no, we're coming up on time, or are we just getting a 5-minute warning?
You're coming up on time because I want to make sure
Yeah,
that I can stop the cast and get James
Ah.
set up.
Okay, yeah. So things real quick for me to sum up. But like, if you know that a player is really into, they want to be the best swordsman in the land or something like that, or like they're really talking about maybe recovering a lost relic. Like that's a great automatic like thread situation or thread item situation to get people involved in and start building out knowledges based on that. Um, yeah, I think like Haven's actually great in a lot of ways, similar to other adventures. Like you're starting further away from like halls of power, so you get the smaller setting where you get to kind of play around with local politics and introduce bigger things at a different pace to see what people are interested in. So like from session zero onward, like whenever anyone seems to like react enthusiastically to something, I'm always taking notes. I'm like, okay, how can I incorporate this later down the line? Yeah, that's all I got. I think you gave a great answer to begin with, so I'm not gonna add to it.
all right, so that's our time. So I do want to end this by just saying thanks to the community. I never thought that we would progress the LOB series as much as it has been. There's been great feedback, great interest from the community. So always thankful for that. And Karol, do you have any other closing thoughts?
No, just like Michael said, just nothing but gratitude to everybody. Love the Earthon community. Love making stuff for y'all to play with, and really, really exploring these worlds.
Thank you both.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sandy.